Welcome to Management 2110's Chapter 2 lecture, based on the readings from the textbook Management, 13th edition. Actually, we're using the 14th edition. We've actually upped our edition by Robbins and Coulter, and we're going to get started. So first, we'll cover the learning objectives of Chapter 2. And that's describe the 8 steps in the decision-making process. We're going to develop our skill of being creative. And we're going to explain the 4 ways managers make decisions. We're going to classify decisions and decision-making conditions. And we're going to describe different decision-making styles and discuss how biases affect decision-making. We're going to know how to recognize when you're using decision-making errors and biases and what to do about it. And then we're going to identify effective decision-making techniques and models. So this slide could be more true. For many reasons of you moving into the management field or role, your decisions will have a huge impact on your organizations. Therefore, your organization is to benefit from your strategies or ideas. You will have to be an effective decision maker. In doing so, you will also experience a more fostered trust from your leadership or administration, also your subordinates. So managers at all levels and in all areas of organizations make decisions. That is, they make choices. Although decision-making is typically described as choosing among alternatives, this view is too simplistic. Why? Because decision-making is, and should be, a process, not just a simple act of choosing among alternatives. And this slide depicts an effective decision-making process found in the textbook. First, you identify a problem, and next you're moving into identifying decision criteria. Okay. Next, you're going to go into allocating weights on the criteria. You're going to prioritize what's important, what is not. And then you're going to develop alternatives. Should I go this direction or should I go that direction? If I have a plan A, am I going to have a plan B as a backup for a little bit of risk management? We talked about risk management last chapter. Then we're going to go on to analyzing those alternatives, and that's where we do our risk assessments. Then we're going to go into selecting an alternative, whether it's plan A or plan B, and then we're going to implement the alternative. And then you always evaluate. And evaluating takes a lot of reflective thinking, reflective inquiry, and action inquiry. Did I do the right thing? Did I do something similar in the past that was either productive or counterproductive? Am I altering my actions based on what I've done in the past? This is all your reflective thinking and inquiry. Then you got to deal with your action inquiry. It's going to be taking what you come up with from your reflection, and then you're going to put a plan into action. So we'll take that model and break it down further, starting with the first step, identify a problem. Every decision starts with a problem, a discrepancy between an existing and a desired condition. For our example, we're going to use Amanda. Amanda is a sales manager whose reps need new laptops because their old ones are outdated and inadequate for doing their job. To make it simple, assume it's not economical to add memory to the old computers, and it's the company's policy to purchase, not lease. So you have to use those variables. Now we have a problem. The disparity between the sales rep's current computers, the existing condition, and their need to have more efficient one. And that's the desired condition. So Amanda has a decision to make. Once a manager has identified a problem, he or she must identify the decision criteria important or relevant to solving the problem. Okay? What resolution here? Every decision maker has criteria guiding his or her decisions, even if they're not explicitly stated. In our example, Amanda decides after careful consideration that memory and storage capabilities, display quality, battery life, warranty, and carrying weight are all relevant criteria to her decision. Many times, using this example is one method, but many times your organizations, may have criteria in the form of policies or procedures, standard operating procedures that you're going to have to reference, and some of them may be buried in some guidance or mandates, in some books or manuals. So you're going to have to do your research when it comes down to establishing the criteria. So step 3, we're going to allocate weights to the criteria. Now, if the relevant criteria aren't equally important, the decision maker must place weight on the items in order to give them correct priority in the decision. How? The simple way is to give the most important criterion a weight of 10 and then assign weights to the rest using that standard. Of course, you could always use any number as the highest weight. So the weighted criteria for our example is shown in the illustration and on the next slide. So see here, the most emphasis was placed on memory and storage, rightfully so. Therefore, it was prioritized. Then battery life, carrying weight, warranty, and display quality. This is the same order I'd actually place them in. The fourth step in the decision-making process requires the decision maker to list viable alternatives that could resolve the problem. In this step, a decision maker needs to be creative, and the alternatives are only listed, not evaluated, just yet. Our sales manager, Amanda, identifies 8 laptops as possible choices. And this is Amanda's breakdown based on her possible choices with corresponding criteria. I'm going to leave that there for a little bit for you to look at. All right, moving on. Once alternatives have been identified, a decision maker must evaluate each one. How? By using the criteria established in step 2. This exhibit 2-3 shows the assessed values that Amanda gave each alternative after doing some research on them. And that was illustrated in the previous slide. So keep in mind that this data, you also will see these illustrations in your textbook, by the way. And keep in mind that this data represents an assessment of the 8 alternatives used in the decision criteria, but not the weighting. Okay, so when you multiply each alternative by the assigned weight, you get the weighted alternatives as shown in Exhibit 2-4. The total score for each alternative then is the sum of the weighted criteria. Now, sometimes a decision maker might be able to skip this step. If one alternative scores highest on every criterion, you wouldn't need to consider the weights because that alternative would already be the top choice. Okay? So, or if the weights were equal, you would evaluate an alternative merely by summing up the assessed values for each one. So you're going to look again in your text at Exhibit 2-3, or you can go back in these slides. Now, for example, the score for the HP ProBook would be 36, and the score for the Sony NW would be 35. So the 6th step in the decision-making process is choosing the best alternative or the one that generated the highest total in step 5. In our example, and that's in Exhibit 2-4 in your text, Amanda would choose the Dell Inspiron because it scored higher than all other alternatives. And here's our examples illustrating the Dell Inspiron and its scores. Now in step 7 in the decision-making process, you put the decision into action by conveying it to those affected and getting their commitment to it. You need buy-in. Remember, here you could be instituting some kind of organizational change. You want to establish that sense of urgency and build your guiding coalition of change agents. We will talk about organizational change later in this course. But essentially, you know, that's what's happening here. So we know that if people who must implement a decision participate in the process, they're more likely to support it than if you just tell them what to do. So you want to get their buy-in. Another thing managers need to do during implementation is reassess the environment for any changes, especially if it's a long-term decision. Are the criteria, alternatives, and choices still the best ones? Or has the environment changed in such a way that we need to reevaluate? So many steps you need to revisit. Now, the last step in the decision-making process involves evaluating the outcome or result of the decision to see whether the problem was resolved. If the evaluation shows that the problem still exists, then the manager needs to assess what went wrong. And that's what I was saying in the previous slide. Some of these steps you're going to have to, you're going to have to revisit. So was the problem incorrectly defined? Were errors made when evaluating alternatives? Were you comparing apples to apples or apples to oranges? Now, was the right alternative selected but poorly implemented? So then you get into the quality or methodology. And then the answers might lead you to redo an earlier step, or might even require starting the whole process over again. Now, although everyone in an organization makes decision making is particularly important to managers. And this slide illustrates it's part of all 4 managerial functions. Remember we went over the functions of a manager in the last chapter? In fact, that's why we say that decision making is the essence of management. And that's why managers, when they plan, organize, lead, or control 4 functions, are called decision makers. So in planning, we're looking at what are the organization's long-term objectives. We're looking at what strategies will best achieve those objectives. We're also looking at what should the organization's short-term objectives be, and we're also looking at how difficult should individual goals be. Now, in the function of organizing, how many people should I have report directly to me? You want to concentrate on your locus of control. You don't want to diminish quality because of quantity. Now, how much centralization should be there in the organization? And then you're going to evaluate the empowerment I talked about in chapter 1. You're going to evaluate, and maybe examine shared leadership approaches, or maybe the organization culture being so hierarchical isn't working anymore. And then you're going to look at how should jobs be designed. Next, when should the organization implement a different structure? Moving on to the function of leading. How do I handle employees that appear to be unmotivated? Now, what is the most effective leadership style in a given situation? You're going to find leadership styles change. There's an excellent approach to leadership. It's called situational leadership by Blanchard and Hersey. It's something that especially those of you who deal with the VUCA occurrences I spoke about in the last chapter, when things get volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, you're not going to manage or lead the same with everyone, okay? And that particular model examines your actions as a leader based on a subordinate's competence and commitment, the different varying levels of competence and commitment, because you can't have a blanket style of leading people. Next, you're going to move into how will a specific change affect worker productivity. And then you're going to go into what is the right time to stimulate conflict. Now, conflict, some of you may say, why would I want to institute conflict in a situation? Remember, conflict can be constructive or destructive, okay, depending on the type of conflict. We're talking about constructive conflict here, okay? Something that's going to trigger brainstorming. It's okay to have disagreements. Sometimes disagreements, end up resulting in more productivity because a great idea comes from somebody who doesn't agree with a certain methodology you're using. So conflict can be very healthy. Okay, you as a leader, you just have to know how to control it. And we're moving into controlling. what activities in the organization need to be controlled? How should those activities be controlled? And then when is a performance deviation significant? And then we're going to get into measuring the effectiveness and efficiency. Okay? And what type of management information system should the organization have? So we assume that managers will use rational decision making. That is, they'll make logical and consistent choices to maximize value. After all, managers have all sorts of tools and techniques to help them be rational decision makers. Managers aren't always rational. What does it mean to be a rational decision maker? A rational decision maker would be fully objective and logical. The problem faced would be clear and unambiguous, and the decision maker would have a clear and specific goal and know all possible alternatives and consequences. Finally, making decisions rationally would consistently lead to selecting the alternatives that maximizes the likelihood of achieving the goal. So this is a very analytical process. Now, a more realistic approach to describing how managers make decisions is the concept of bounded rationality, which basically says that managers make decisions rationally but are bounded by their ability to process information. Because they can't possibly analyze all information on all alternatives, managers satisfice rather than maximize. That's not sacrifice, that's satisfice. It's in your textbook. That is, they accept solutions that are good enough. Okay, this drive organizations have just to meet compliance, is setting mindsets that we just have to be good enough. If I'm meeting all my goals and objectives, I'm doing my job. But don't you think the organizations want you to span those boundaries and do better? Of course they do. So they're being rational within limits, bounds. I'm talking about managers. They're being rational with limits, and it's bounding them of their ability to process information. Okay? They're looking to just meet those goals. However, keep in mind that their decision making is also likely influenced by the organization's culture, international politics, power considerations, and by a phenomenon called escalation of commitment, an increased commitment to a previous decision despite evidence that may have been wrong. Okay? So the escalation of commitment, an increased commitment to a previous decision despite the evidence that it may have been wrong. Okay? A lot of times, you see certain dynamics. If many of you know what groupthink is, the powers of leadership sometimes sway people to just go along with the guy who's in charge and not speak up to say, sir or ma'am, I believe that that's not the best approach or the most effective or efficient approach. So they just go along with it because, the old saying that one decision's, better than no decision. Well, that's not always the case. Sometimes you need to engage in that innovation and creativity and foster diversity and open the floor up for everybody to present an idea. Okay, so what is intuitive decision making? It's making decisions on the basis of experience, feelings, and accumulated judgment. Researchers studying managers' use of intuitive decision making have identified 5 different aspects of intuition, which are described on the next slide. And this slide does an excellent job of breaking down intuition. I'll just leave it up here. So you have the values or ethics-based decisions, and that's when managers make decisions based on ethical values or culture. Okay, I want to make those decisions that are very consistent with my organization's core values. Why? Because any deviation may be an ethical violation. Okay, now we're going to move on to the experience-based decisions. And then you have managers make decisions based on their past experiences. Now, we just spoke about that. Sometimes that engages the reflection, the reflective thinking, reflective inquiry, and that's when you're saying, faced with a problem, I made a decision in the past. Are we comparing apples to apples or apples to oranges? Would that decision and all the decision steps in that process be productive here when faced with this problem? You want to make sure you're comparing apples to apples. Next, we're going to affect-initiated decisions. And that's when managers make decisions based on feelings or emotions. Depends on the manager whether you want to take this approach. If the manager espouses the same values as the organization, the manager's approaches are fundamentally sound, it may end up being a good decision. If the manager's acting on subjective responsibility, that inner voice that says, this can drive to make us a little bit more money. I know what the company policy says, but we're going to do something different. That may end up resulting in a bad choice. Okay. Next, we're going to cover the subconscious mental processing, and that's when managers use data from subconscious mind to help them make decisions. A little bit about what I just spoke about in the effect initiated. Sometimes it could be, very favorable, and sometimes it's going to be negative, depending on the manager who's making the decision. Next, we're going to cover cognitive-based decisions. And that's the managers make decisions based on skills, knowledge, and training. This is highly fundamental. You have a highly skilled manager who's well-educated and well-seasoned. It could be an excellent approach to intuition. Now, any decision-making process is likely to enhance through the use of relevant and reliable evidence, whether it's buying someone a birthday present or wondering which new washing machine to buy. So that's the premise behind evidence-based management, EBMGT. That's the acronym. Okay, the systematic use of the best available evidence to improve management practice. So this evidence-based management is quite relevant to managerial decision-making. 4 essential elements of evidence-based management are decision makers' expertise and judgment, external evidence that it's been evaluated by the decision maker, opinions, preferences, and values of those who have a stake in the decision, and relevant organizational internal factors such as context, circumstances, and organizational members. So some problems are straightforward. The decision maker's goal is clear, the problem is familiar, and information about the problem is easily defined and complete. Such situations are called structured problems because they're straightforward, familiar, and easily defined. Because it's not an unusual occurrence, there's probably some standardized routine for handling. This is what we call a program decision, a repetitive decision that can be handled by a routine approach. Now, because the problem is structured, the manager doesn't have to go through the trouble and expense of going through an involved decision-making process. To develop the alternative stage of the decision-making process either doesn't exist or is given little attention. Why? Because once the structured problem is defined, the solution is usually self-evident or at least reduced to a few alternatives that are familiar and have proved successful in the past. So structured problems and program decisions continued. You have the procedure, a series of sequential steps used to respond to a well-structured problem. You have the rules, an explicit statement that tells managers what can or cannot be done. And you have policy, a guideline for making decisions. So the procedure is a series of sequential steps a manager uses to respond to a structured problem. The only difficulty is identifying the problem. So once it's clear so is the procedure. For instance, a purchasing manager receives a request from a warehouse manager for 15 tablets for the inventory clerks. So not all problems managers face can be solved using program decisions. Many organizational situations involve unstructured problems, new or unusual problems for which information is ambiguous or incomplete. So whether to build a new manufacturing facility in China is an example of an unstructured problem. So again, unstructured problems, problems that are new or unusual. We're going to go back to that. New and unusual, and for which information is ambiguous or incomplete. Then you have the non-programmed decisions, unique and non-reoccurring, and involve custom-made solutions. So this slide describes the difference between programmed and non-programmed decisions. Lower-level managers mostly rely on programmed decisions. Those are the procedures, rules, and policies. A lot of times they're referencing those books and manuals. And because they confront familiar and repetitive problems. Usually it's in production. As managers move up, or it could be customer service. As managers move up the organizational hierarchy, the problems they confront become more unstructured. And that's where you get into those VUCA times. So here we have decision-making conditions. We have certainty, which is a situation in which a manager can make accurate decisions because all outcomes are known. They're certain. Then next you have risk, and that's a situation in which a decision maker is able to estimate the likelihood of certain outcomes. Next you have uncertainty, and that's a situation in which a decision maker has neither certainty nor reasonable probability estimates available. So the ideal situation for making decisions is one of certainty, of course, a situation where managers can make accurate decisions because the outcome of every alternative is known. For example, when Wyoming State Treasurer decides where to deposit excess state funds, he knows exactly the interest rate offered by each bank and the amount that will be earned on the funds. So he is certain about the outcomes of each alternative. And as you might expect, most managerial decisions are not like this. So, managing risk. This is always a fun one. Your textbook, you want to visit managing risk. There are some mathematic formulas you're going to want to know on risk management that help you establish probability. So if any of you, likelihood. So if any of you have a statistics background or have taken statistics yet, managing risk is going to be a little easier for you. Don't be afraid, though. The textbook and my test questions are not going to have you doing statistic formulas. So, but it's definitely something you want to understand when it comes down to risk management. You want to know probabilities. So just remember, managers can use historical data from past experiences or secondary information that lets them assign probabilities to different alternatives. And managers use this information to help make decisions by calculating the expected value, the expected return from each possible outcome, by multiplying expected revenues by the probability. And that math is in the text, so you definitely want to visit it. So your thinking style reflects two things. Okay, first, the source of information you tend to use, that's the external data or facts, or internal sources such as feelings and intuition, which we just spoke of. And two, whether you process that information in a linear way, it's rational, logical, or analytical, or a nonlinear way, intuitive, creative, and insightful. So these four dimensions are collapsed into two styles. First, the linear thinking style is characterized by a person's preference for using external data and facts and processing this information through rational, logical thinking to guide decisions and actions. The second, nonlinear thinking style, is characterized by a preference of internal sources of information, those feelings and intuition, and processing this information with internal insights, feelings, and hunches to guide decisions and actions. So, decision-making biases and errors. I think I created a match game for you, and also you want to play the Jeopardy games. I highly encourage that you do both. Okay, so we have heuristics. Okay, using rules of thumb to simplify decision-making. A lot of times that will create biases and constraints to your thinking. Okay, rules of thumb, they can be effective if you really don't have an answer. If the organization has a rule of thumb, chances are it's going through some analysis. The only thing is, it's going to bound the outcomes. Okay, you won't be spanning any boundaries with rules of thumb. You won't be getting those best practices, if any of you are familiar with best practices. Heuristics, sometimes they work, and sometimes you have to watch out for them. So we're going to go over some of the biases and errors associated with. So we're going to go over the overconfidence bias. And we all know this guy holds unrealistically positive view of himself and his performance. He always has the right answer. Okay, everybody's going to know these people as I'm going through them. Okay, you're going to visualize somebody in your organization. It's going to remind you of somebody. It's going to, I don't know, it makes me laugh because I'm thinking I'm visualizing people who I work with. Next, we're going to go with immediate gratification bias. And that's choosing alternatives that offer immediate rewards and avoid immediate costs. Okay, that's the easy one. Okay, that's the easy breezy way of doing things. It also could bound you. You may not span any boundaries with this method. Okay, but you're going to choose that immediate reward. Sometimes it'll look like a win. Okay. So, back to the slide, I just want to make a point that when managers make decisions, they not only use their own particular style, they may use rules of thumb or heuristics to simplify their decision making. I want to make sure I'm also covering, what the text is saying for your test purposes. Rules of thumb can be useful because they help make sense of complex, uncertain, ambiguous information. Even though managers may use rules of thumb, that doesn't mean those rules of thumb are reliable, like I was just saying. Why? Because they may lead to errors and biases. So, we have the anchoring effect. Okay? That's fixating on initial information and ignoring subsequent information. Okay? So that's going to drive your decision. That initial information that you gain, you're not listening to anything after. You're just going with it. You're moving with it. You're taking that information and not encompassing maybe the details. And the details would make or break whether or not that was a good decision that you made. Then you have the selective perception bias. And that's selecting, organizing, and interpreting events based on the decision maker's biased perceptions. Okay, we all know that person. Okay, they have biased perceptions. Why is this the best idea? Well, maybe if it's highly subjective, maybe the decision maker, the outcome may be beneficial to them, but not everybody else or the organization. And then we have the confirmation bias. And that's seeking out information that reaffirms past choices while discounting contradicting information. Okay? That's the guy who made, or the girl who made the decision, and they're going to go and get the data that supports their decision, but they're not going to encompass the data that maybe shows that they didn't have the best idea. Okay? And I'm sure we all have come across that. So the anchoring effect describes how decision makers fixate on initial information as a starting point, and then once set, fail to adequately adjust for subsequent information. So first impressions, ideas, prices, and estimates carry unwarranted weight relative to information received later. So when decision makers selectively organize and interpret events based on their biased perceptions, they're using selective perception. So then we have the framing bias, selecting and highlighting certain aspects of a situation while ignoring others. It's good for you. It's football season right now, and it's good for you fantasy football players or enthusiasts, who are trying to maybe coerce people into selecting other players. You want to talk about how many yards somebody's rushed, but not talked about how many fumbles a player's had. Okay, so you're framing it for them. You're trying to sway them. It's persuasive. Okay, that's highlighting just what you want everybody to know. Okay, to get agreement. And then next you have the availability bias. That's losing decision-making objectivity by focusing on the most recent events. A lot of times when talking about terrorist activities, anything that's recent, you're going to have more emotions about it. Okay, more emotions in your audience. So you're focusing on those recent events when maybe trying to sell an idea because you're going to get more buy-in. Of course, when you're trying to sell something that's based off of a catastrophic event, it's going to be a lot easier to get buy-in because the emotions that are associated with the recent event. Then you have representation bias. That's drawing analogies and seeing identical situations when none exist. And then you're going to have randomness bias, and that's creating unfounded meaning out of random events. Okay, so the framing bias is when decision makers select and highlight certain aspects of a situation while excluding others. And by drawing attention to specific aspects of a situation or highlighting them, while at the same time downplaying or omitting other aspects, they distort what they see and create incorrect reference points. Okay. Then remember, with the availability bias happens when decision makers tend to remember events that are most recent and vivid in their memory. The result? It distorts their ability to recall events in an objective manner and results in distorted judgments and probability estimates. So, when decision makers assess the likelihood of an event based on how closely it resembles other events or sets of events, that's the representation bias. And managers exhibiting this bias draw analogies and see identical situations where they don't exist. Now, the randomness bias describes the actions of decision makers who try to create meaning out of random events. They do this because most decision makers have difficulty dealing with chance, even though random events happen to everyone, and there's nothing that can be done to predict them. So next we have more biases and errors. We have the sunk cost errors, and that's forgetting that current actions cannot influence past events and relate only to future consequences. Next we have the self-serving bias, and that's taking quick credit for success and blaming outside factors for failures. And next we have hindsight bias, and that's mistakenly believing that an event could have been predicted once the actual outcome is known. Okay. The sunk cost error occurs when decision makers forget that current choices can't correct the past. They incorrectly fixate on past expenditures of time, money, or effort in assessing choices rather than on future consequences. Now, instead of ignoring sunk costs, they can't forget them. Now, decision makers who are quick to take credit for their successes and to blame failure on outside factors are exhibiting the self-serving bias, and we all know that guy. Finally, the hindsight bias is the tendency for decision makers to falsely believe that they would have accurately predicted the outcome of an event once that event is actually known, once the outcome is actually known. Now, a lot of people like the Monday morning quarterback decisions of others, and hindsight epitomizes that. So this slide provides an overview of managerial decision making. Now, because it's in their best interests, managers want to make good decisions. That is, choose the best alternative, implement it, and determine whether it takes care of the problem, which is the reason the decision was needed in the first place. I'm going to give you a moment to digest this slide. Decision making is serious business. Your abilities and track record as an effective decision maker will determine how your organizational performance is evaluated and whether you'll be promoted to a higher positions of responsibility. So below are some guidelines to help you be a better decision maker. You want to understand cultural differences. You want to create standards for good decision making. You want to know when it's time to call it quits. You want to use an effective decision-making process, like we went over in the earlier part of this chapter. You want to build an organization that can spot the unexpected and quickly adapt to the changed environment. Adaptability is key, especially when we're talking about things that are volatile or occurrences that are volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. The more that technological advancements make it to the workplaces, the more VUCA occurrences you will see. So, the way managers approach decision making using a rational and analytical mindset, identifying problems, coming up with alternatives, evaluating alternatives, and choosing one of those alternatives may not be best and certainly not the only choice in today's environment. That's where design thinking comes in. Design thinking has been described as approaching management problems as designers approach design problems. So, in review of the first learning objective, describing the 8 steps in the decision-making process, remember that a decision is a choice. The decision-making process consists of 8 steps. First, you're going to identify the problem. Second, you're going to identify decision criteria. Third, you're going to weight the criteria. Fourth, you're going to develop alternatives. The fifth, you're going to analyze those alternatives. The sixth, you're going to select alternatives. 7, you're going to implement alternatives. And 8, you're going to evaluate the decision's effectiveness. There's always an evaluation. You don't just want to implement and just close your eyes and bet it's going to work. So moving on to the second learning objective for the chapter, we've explained the 4 ways managers make decisions. The assumptions of rationality are as follows. The problem is clear and unambiguous. A single well-defined goal is to be achieved. All alternatives and consequences are known, and the final choice will maximize the payoff. Remember that bounded rationality says that managers make rational decisions, but are limited by their ability to process information. Continuing, remember that satisficing happens when decision makers accept solutions that are good enough. With escalation of commitment, managers increase commitment to a decision even when they have evidence that may have been the wrong decision. That's just going with it. Okay, remember, sometimes, people go off the premise that at least I made a decision, and one decision is better than no decision. Well, sometimes, it takes a little bit of brainstorming, intuition, diversity, and innovation to come up with the right decision. So, going with a decision just because it's a decision may not be the best route. Then you want to remember that intuitive decision making means making decisions on the basis of experience, feelings, and accumulated judgment. Using evidence-based management, a manager makes decisions based on the best available evidence. Now, the third learning objective was to classify decisions and decision-making conditions. You want to remember that programmed decisions are repetitive decisions that can be handled by a routine approach and are used when the problem being resolved is straightforward, familiar, and easily defined. These are the tools and techniques of your organization based on mandates that can usually be found in manuals or standard operating procedures. Okay, we're not dealing with complexities here. Then you have the non-programmed decisions, and they're unique decisions that require a custom-made solution that are used when the problems are new or unusual, that being unstructured, and for which information is ambiguous or incomplete. That's the VUCA environment. That's where you're going to have to think on your feet, and it's a good thing you're a managerial student, because how you're going to shape your decision in a situation like that is going to be based on your subjective responsibilities, what that inner voice is telling you should be doing, and it's going to shape your decision making, and that's going to come off your training and education. Okay, so you're educating yourself to make better decisions here. So when faced with those complexities, you're going to be able to make better decisions than the person who's untrained, uneducated. Okay, moving along. Continuing with the third learning objective, remember that certainty is a situation in which a manager can make accurate decisions because all outcomes are known. Risk is a situation in which a manager can estimate the likelihood of certain outcomes. Remember, you want to visit the part of the chapter that deals with the probability math. Okay? Uncertainty is a situation in which a manager is not certain about the outcomes and can't even make reasonable probability estimates. That's the VUCA environment. So when decision makers face uncertainty, their psychological orientation will determine whether they follow a maxi-max choice, that is maximizing the maximum possible payoff, a maxi-min choice, that is maximizing the minimum possible payoff, or the mini-max choice, that's minimizing the maximum regret. That's the amount of money that could have been made if the different decision had been made. Okay, so you want to know those terms. I believe I cover them in the Jeopardy game. So make sure that you play Jeopardy. Okay, the fourth learning objective involved describing different decision-making styles and discussing how biases affect decision-making. It is important to remember a person's thinking style reflects two things: the source of information you tend to use, whether external or internal, and how you process the information, whether it's linear or nonlinear. So these four dimensions were collapsed into two styles. The linear thinking style is characterized by a person's preference for using external data and processing this information through rational, logical thinking. Now, the nonlinear thinking style is characterized by a preference for internal sources of information and processing this information with internal sights, feelings, and hunches. Okay, the 12 common decision-making errors and biases include overconfidence, immediate gratification, anchoring, selective perception, confirmation, framing, availability, representation, randomness, sunk costs, self-serving bias, and hindsight. So the managerial decision-making model helps explain how decision-making process is used to choose the best alternatives, either through maximizing or satisficing, and then implement, and evaluate the alternative. It also helps explain what factors affect the decision-making process, including the decision-making approach, rationality, bounded rationality, intuition, the types of problems and decisions, whether they're well-structured, programmed, unstructured, and non-programmed, the decision-making conditions, whether they're certainty, risk, or uncertainty, and the decision maker's style, whether it's linear or non-linear. So the fifth and final learning objective, identify effective decision-making techniques, fostered an understanding that managers can make effective decisions by understanding cultural differences in decision-making, knowing when it's time to call it quits using an effective decision-making process, and building an organization that can spot the unexpected and quickly adapt to the changed environment. An effective decision-making process focuses on what's important. It's logical and consistent. It acknowledges both subjective and objective thinking and blends both analytical and intuitive approaches. And finally, it requires only enough information as it is necessary to resolve a problem. In concluding our final outcome, number 5 encourages and guides gathering relevant information and informed options. And 6 is straightforward, reliable, easy to use, and flexible. Now, the 5 habits of highly reliable organizations are: first, not being tricked by their success. 2, deferring to experts on the front line. 3, letting unexpected circumstances provide the solution. 4, embracing complexity. And 5, anticipating but also recognizing limits. Remember that design thinking is approaching management problems as designers approach design problems. It can be useful when identifying problems and when identifying and evaluating alternatives. Thank you for your participation in the Chapter 2 lecture. Stay tuned for the Chapter 3 lecture. Until then, check Blackboard for the week's activities and assignments. Thank you, and I will see you in Chapter 3.